The Huffy Highland is a mountain bike that, despite being advertised as such, is not an actual mountain bike. I bought it a couple years ago for $70, and currently it retails for double the price. It's generally advised not to use a department store bike on the trails, but that's exactly what I did, and it's what some other people have done, and their experiences have not been so good.
Threadless headsets. Out, reality started to set in.
Oh, this is bad. Oh, that was bad. Big rock hitting my chainring. Oh. What is that sound?
On my trail bike, this janky rock garden is a blast. On this bike, I couldn't wait for it to be over.
Now, a lot of people might consider it low-hanging fruit to criticize this bike for being at its price point. I think it's important to do so because it's a cheap bike, so a lot of people are going to use it, and also the intended purpose of it is quite muddied. See, mountain biking is an expensive sport, and a lot of people want a cheaper alternative to the existing bikes that are expensive. And this really is not a real mountain bike. It's not really something you would want to use on the trail. It's more of a road bike or more of a commuter bike that's dressed up as a mountain bike. So firstly, I want to talk about the brake system. The brakes on this bike are mechanical brake pads, and for the most part, they do their job, but they do squeak a lot, and honestly, they're not very effective. They just somewhat break. On one particular jump I made on the trail, I heard a snap, and the rear brakes actually stopped working because the cable that was connected to the brakes actually broke. So I lost half my brakes there. And personally, I would prefer having rotary brakes on it. I know most professionals would recommend having rotary brakes over brake pads, so that's another disadvantage that this bike has. Although, being at this price point, you can't really blame the manufacturers for not putting those in, but they're just not that good, the existing brakes. The next thing I want to talk about is the gear system on the bike. Now, this bike uses a 3x gear system, meaning there's gears in the back and gears in the front, and 2 handles on the bars that control both gears. Now, this bike has 7 gears on the back and 3 gears on the front, meaning there's 21 total gear combinations that you can make with both handles. Now, this may seem good because you have a lot more options with 21 speeds than you would with a 10 or 12 speed bike, but for a beginner or just anyone that's not used to a 3x system, it's really not that good, because if you shift wrong, it's a lot easier to have the brakes jump or the bike lock up, which I've had happened to me many times and causes my feet to fly off and hit the metal on the footrest and injure my ankles, and it happens a lot. It's also easier for other mechanical failures to happen, and it's just a lot more complicated to use a 3x gear system. Personally, I would prefer to have a 1x system because most professionals recommend only 10 to 12 speeds on any mountain bike. And also, I would prefer having the push lever rather than having the turning rotary handle. I think that's easier to use. The amount of times that the gears lock up in the back is so annoying. It's just terrible. On to cosmetic damage on the bike. The cosmetic damage isn't too bad, but there's one major one, which would be the footrest. Now, the footrests on this bike are made of plastic, and as you can see, one of them is about to shatter off. This is just another part of the poor build quality on the bike. Although it is cheap to buy better even metal footrests for the bike, I don't want to invest any more money into this bike. I think it would be better to buy a more expensive bike and then buy footrests for that. Even though you can buy footrests for $20 on eBay, I still don't want to spend the money on this bike. The next part I want to talk about is the fork, or the front suspension, and this is a big deal, because for the longest time I've been wondering why the front suspension is so bad, because every rock and every stone I feel, it's almost like the bike has no suspension at all. Going over bumps on the trail, not getting any air, but going over any bumps on the trail, you feel everything, and it's just the worst feeling. There's no rear suspension, of course, at this bike. I have seen department store bikes with rear suspension, but they're not that good either. So I went on Target's website and looked for the front suspension, and although Target did have it advertised, they didn't have any numbers about the front suspension. They just had wheel size measurements and other derivative stuff. So I had to go to the manufacturer's website, and on there I was searching for a little bit, and eventually I went to the Q&A section, and I found the actual specifications. The front fork only has 40 millimeters of front travel. Only 40 millimeters of travel. That's terrible. That's basically nothing. You see, most bikes should have 70 to 80 millimeters of travel, and professional bikes would have over 100 or 120 millimeters of travel. But this bike doesn't have rear suspension, it only has front suspension, and it only has 40 millimeters of front suspension. Now, 40 millimeters is about 1.5 inches, which is terrible. 1.5 inches doesn't stop you from feeling anything, really. It's basically nothing. And that's one of the biggest problems I have with this bike, is the fact that they didn't advertise any statistics about this, and it just goes to show that the type of person they're aiming this towards is not someone who wants to get into mountain biking, but it's someone that's just looking for a bike, and it happens to be stylish and look like a mountain bike, so they're just going to choose it. But you would not want to take this thing out on the trail, and that's what I mean when I say it's not a real mountain bike. So, to conclude, despite the many drawbacks that this bike has for mountain biking, I think that if you want just the best basic bike that you can get at a department store for commuting to classes between college, or using it just for fun, or giving it to kids, it might be a bit too big, I think this bike is a good option for that. I don't think it's the worst bike ever made. Now, that being said, if you're going to use this bike for real mountain biking every day on the trails, I think that this bike might not be the best. The fork is terrible. Based off my experience with this bike, you're not going to have a good time with it on the trails, that's for certain. You will have to make some key upgrades, but you might not want to invest too much into this bike. You might want a more advanced bike, maybe $300 or $400. So yeah, if you're not using it for mountain biking, it's the best bike. If you are using it for mountain biking, it's not the best bike. And don't buy it for $150 because I bought it for $70 and there's no way that it's actually worth $150. You're gonna get scammed if you buy it like that. So yeah, that's my review of this bike. Like, comment, and subscribe.